They had left her because her legs were not as long as the others, because the cold bit at her rounder cheeks with a particular viciousness, and because in the long, lean winter, her body clung to its reserves with a stubbornness they deemed a burden. That too chubby a girl, they had whispered, a weight they could no longer afford to carry. Now, she was alone, a small, dark shape against the vast, indifferent white of the high plains. The wind, a razor of a thing, sliced through her thin tunic, stealing the warmth from her skin and the courage from her heart. Tears froze into tiny, sharp crystals on her face before they could even fall, a constellation of grief on her soft skin. She had cried until her throat was raw, until the sound was just a dry, rasping sob swallowed by the howling emptiness. Then, silence fell inside her, a silence as profound and terrifying as the landscape itself. She curled into the lee of a granite boulder, her small body a tight knot of misery, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of snow and skeletal aspens. The world was a canvas of grey and white, unforgiving and absolute. Hope was a flicker, a dying ember she could no longer feel. She was 8 years old, and she was waiting for the end. The sun, a pale, distant coin, began its slow descent, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and cold, liquid gold. The cold deepened, seeping into her bones, a lethargy that felt almost like a comfort, a final, heavy blanket. It would be easy, she thought with the detached clarity of the truly lost, to simply close her eyes and let the white dark take her. The world had already erased her, this was just the final, formal step. Her name, the one her mother had given her, felt like a ghost on her tongue, unspoken, unheard, already forgotten by everyone but her. He found her not through sound, but through stillness. Silas was a man who moved through the world by reading its subtle grammar, the snap of a twig, the disturbed pattern of frost on a log, the unnatural quiet that signaled a predator or its prey. He was tracking a bull elk, its heavy prints a clear story in the day-old snow, when he saw her. A smudge of brown and grey against the rock, so still he almost dismissed it as a shadow. But shadows didn't have the soft curve of a shoulder, nor did they wear the fine powder of fresh snow on their hair. He stilled, his hand resting on the smooth stock of the rifle slung over his shoulder. A child. Alone. His mind, a cold and practical machine honed by years of solitude, immediately listed the liabilities. A mouth to feed. A vulnerability. A magnet for the kind of trouble that stalked these broken lands. He had his own ghosts, he had no room for another. He should have turned, melted back into the trees, and left this small, sad piece of evidence for the coyotes. It was the law of this new, hard world. You carry your own weight, or you are left behind. He had seen it happen a dozen times. Yet, he could not move. Something in the huddled shape reminded him of a different darkness, a small grave on a windswept hill next to a larger one. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass in the heart. He lowered his rifle slowly, the movement deliberate, meant to make no sound. He approached with the caution of a man approaching a wounded animal, his boots sinking softly into the snow. He saw the tracks leading away from her, the frantic, deep prints of many adults, and hers, smaller, struggling to keep up, then stopping. They had not even looked back. A quiet, cold rage settled in his gut. He knelt a few feet away, the motion fluid. He unhooked the water skin from his belt, then reached into his satchel and pulled out a strip of dried venison, dark and hard as wood. He said nothing, simply set them on the snow between them. An offering without promise, a question without words. The girl, Ilara, did not flinch. Her eyes, wide and dark in her pale, round face, lifted from the snow and fixed on him. They were not the eyes of a child. They held the ancient, weary knowledge of betrayal. For a long moment, she just stared, her small chest barely rising and falling. She watched his hands, calloused and scarred, resting on his knees. She watched his face, weathered as an old stone, his beard streaked with grey, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He made no move to come closer. He simply waited, a statue of patience. The silence stretched, broken only by the sighing of the wind through the pines. Slowly, as if lifting a great weight, she reached out a hand. Her fingers, chapped and blue with cold, trembled as they closed around the jerky. She did not snatch it. She drew it back to her chest, holding it like a precious, fragile thing. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, she picked up the water skin. She drank, long and deep, the water spilling down her chin. Silas watched, his expression unreadable. He saw the flicker of life return to her eyes, the barest hint of color touch her lips. When she was done, she looked at the jerky, then back at him. It was a test. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Permission granted. She bit into the tough meat, her small teeth working at it with a desperate, single-minded focus. He rose to his feet. His work here, the small, inexplicable penance he had paid to his own ghosts, was done. He turned and began to walk away, back towards the elk tracks, back towards the solitude that was his shield. He did not look back. He took 10 steps, then 20. The crunch of his boots was the only sound. Then, he heard it. A different crunch. Softer, lighter, hesitant. He stopped, but did not turn. He listened. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. She was following him. A small, silent shadow matching his steps in the twilight, a question he had not asked and now had to answer. He sighed, a plume of white vapor in the frigid air, and kept walking. Their first days were a lesson in silence. Silas did not speak, and Ilara did not seem capable of it. The trauma had stolen her voice, leaving only a vast, watchful stillness in its place. He communicated through gesture, a language she learned with the swift, desperate intelligence of a survivor. A sharp, downward chop of his hand meant to get down. A pointed finger meant to look. He would tap a particular plant with the toe of his boot, then tap his own mouth, and she knew it was edible. He would show her the 3-lobed leaf of a poison vine and shake his head with grim finality. She was an attentive student. Her eyes missed nothing. She learned to read the clouds for weather, to spot the subtle tremor of a branch that betrayed a squirrel's hiding place, to walk heel-to-toe to muffle her steps. She watched his hands as he set snares, his fingers weaving the wire with an intricate, deadly grace. She watched how he banked their small fire at night, burying the coals in a bed of ash so a single breath could resurrect them in the morning. He was a harsh teacher, demanding without words, but he was a fair one. He never ate until she had eaten. He always took the watch that faced the wind. One evening, as a wet, heavy snow began to fall, turning the world into a slurry of grey slush, he worked with a feverish intensity. He used his hatchet to fell several young pines, stripping their branches with swift, economical strokes. He leaned them against the face of a low cliff, weaving the boughs between them to create a dense, waterproof wall. He built a small reflector wall of stone in front of it and coaxed a flame to life in its shelter. As the storm raged, they sat inside their small lean-to, a pocket of warmth and flickering orange light in a world dissolved into chaos. The heat from the stones warmed her frozen feet. He took off his own heavy wool cloak, the one that smelled of pine smoke and leather on him, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It engulfed her small frame, heavy and secure. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, her expression was not one of fear or watchfulness, but of something fragile and new. Trust. She leaned her head against the rough bark of the shelter wall and, for the first time in days, slept a deep and dreamless sleep. They traveled south for a week, moving through the skeletal forests and across frozen riverbeds. The land was empty, scoured clean by the harsh season. One afternoon, cresting a low ridge, Silas stopped dead. Below them, tucked into a fold of the hills and nearly invisible against the snow-dusted pines, a thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. A cabin. Solitude had taught him that smoke was rarely a sign of welcome. It was a warning, a claim staked against the wilderness. He scanned the area for a long time, his eyes narrowed. No tracks around the perimeter, save for those of a single person and a snowshoe hare. The place was isolated, deliberate. He looked down at Ilara. Her face was thinner now, but her eyes were clear. The journey was wearing on her. They needed a day of rest, a real meal, a roof that wasn't woven from pine boughs. It was a risk, but perhaps a necessary one. He motioned for her to stay put, to sink down behind a snow-laden juniper bush. He unslung his rifle, holding it loosely in one hand, and started down the slope. His approach was a masterclass in stealth, using the terrain to mask his movements. He circled the cabin once, his senses on high alert. He noted the neatly stacked firewood, the tanning rack with a few stretched pelts, the single set of worn snowshoes leaning against the wall. The work of one person. A person who knew what they were doing. He stopped 20 yards from the door and called out, his voice rough from disuse. "Hello." The cabin. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Then, a wooden shutter scraped open, and the barrel of a long gun poked through. A woman's voice, gravelly and sharp, cut through the cold air. "That's close enough. State your name and your business." Name Silas. "Business is I'm passing through. Got a child with me. We mean no harm. Just looking to trade for some supplies. Maybe a hot meal." He stood perfectly still, his hands open and away from his rifle. "Ain't got no charity here," the voice shot back. "And children are a bad omen in these times." The long pause. Silas didn't move, didn't argue. He just waited. He heard a faint shuffling from inside, then the bolt on the door being drawn back with a loud, metallic clank. The door creaked open a few inches. An eye, bright and suspicious as a magpie's, peered out. It belonged to a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard years, her grey hair pulled back in a tight, severe bun. She looked from Silas to the juniper bush where Ilara was hidden. "Show me the child," she commanded. Silas gave a low whistle. Ilara hesitated for a moment, then rose from her hiding spot, the heavy cloak still wrapped around her. She stood there, small and uncertain, her gaze fixed on the snow. The woman, Maeve, studied her for a long time. Her sharp features seemed to soften, just a fraction. The gun barrel lowered slightly. "She looks half frozen. Get in. Both of you." "But my rifle stays on the table where I can see it." Silas nodded, and they approached the cabin. The inside was small, immaculately clean, and smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and stew. A fire blazed in the hearth. Maeve gestured for them to sit at a rough-hewn wooden table. Silas placed his rifle on it, and Maeve set hers on the mantel. She ladled a thick, fragrant rabbit stew into 2 wooden bowls and set them down with a hunk of dark bread. Ilara stared at the steaming food as if it were a miracle. Maeve watched her. "She's a strong-looking girl," the old woman said, her voice losing some of its edge. "Good bones. Not one of the famine folk." They were fools to leave her. Silas didn't reply, just pushed Ilara's bowl closer to her. The girl picked up the spoon and began to eat, slowly at first, then with a hunger that was profound. Maeve sat across from them, nursing a cup of chicory coffee. "What'll you do with her, Silas?" she asked, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Take her south?" "There's nothing there but more of the same." Silas kept his eyes on his bowl, swirling the stew with his spoon. The question hung in the warm air, a question he had been avoiding for days. He had no answer. He was just moving, putting one foot in front of the other. "Don't know," he finally grunted, the words feeling inadequate. "Just getting her away from here." Maeve nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in her sharp eyes. "Sometimes," she said softly, more to herself than to him, "away is the only destination there is." They stayed for 2 days. Under Maeve's gruff care, a measure of life returned to Ilara. The woman showed her how to mend a tear in her tunic with neat, small stitches, her gnarled fingers guiding Ilara's. She gave her a piece of soap and a bucket of hot water, a luxury so profound Ilara almost wept. As she washed, she saw her reflection in the water, a face still round, but no longer puffy with tears. Her eyes, clear and watchful, stared back. She was a different girl from the one who had huddled by the boulder. On the second morning, as Silas prepared their meager pack, Maeve pressed a small, deerskin pouch into Ilara's hand. Inside were 2 flint stones and a small piece of steel. "Fire is life out there," Maeve said, her voice low. "You learn to make it yourself. You don't depend on anyone." It was the first thing that was truly hers. She clutched it tightly. As they prepared to leave, Silas offered Maeve payment, a few well-made snare wires and a small bag of salt. She waved it away. "Keep your salt. Just see she stays safe." Her eyes lingered on Ilara. "The world has a habit of breaking the good ones. Don't let it break her." Silas simply nodded, the weight of the promise settling on him. They walked away from the cabin, turning back once to see Maeve standing in the doorway, a stark silhouette against the warm light. Then they were back in the vast, cold silence of the wilderness. But something had changed. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared memory of warmth, of stew, of a brief, unexpected sanctuary. A few days later, Silas found the tracks. He knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of a deep boot print in the snow. Not his. Not Maeve's. These were heavy, clumsy, made by several men moving fast. He followed the line of them with his eyes. They were heading south. The same direction he was going. And they were fresh. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, settled in his stomach. He looked back at Ilara. She was watching him, her hand instinctively going to the pouch Maeve had given her. She had seen the tracks too. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a dawning comprehension. The people who had left her. It could be no one else. They were hunting, or being hunted, and their path was converging with theirs. Silas stood up, his body taut with a new urgency. He scanned the horizon, the trees, every shadow. The world was no longer just empty. It was now actively hostile. The journey became a flight. Silas pushed them harder, his long strides eating up the miles. He abandoned the open plains for the thicker cover of the forests, their path a winding, difficult line through dense undergrowth and treacherous ravines. The quiet rhythm of their survival was replaced by a tense, hurried watchfulness. Every snapped twig, every cry of a distant bird, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He slept in shorter, lighter bursts, his rifle never leaving his hand. He saw the toll it was taking on Ilara. Fatigue etched dark circles under her eyes, but she never complained. She matched his pace, her small legs pumping, her breathing ragged but steady. She had become an extension of his own senses. Once, she stopped him with a sharp tug on his sleeve, her finger pointing to a ridge above them. He saw nothing at first, then caught it, a flicker of movement, a glint of sunlight on something metal. They dropped into a thicket of firs, their bodies pressed flat against the frozen ground, and waited, hearts pounding in unison, until the danger had passed. Her resilience astounded him. The soft girl left to die was gone, forged into something hard and keen by the wilderness. The memory of his own daughter, fragile as a spring blossom, rose unbidden in his mind. He had failed to protect her from the sickness that swept their settlement. The guilt was a constant, dull ache. Now, this new child, this foundling, was depending on him, and the thought of failing again was a terror far greater than any pursuit. One night, huddled by a smokeless fire in the hollow of a fallen sequoia, he felt her stir. He opened his eyes to find her watching him, her expression unreadable in the faint, flickering light. She reached out and touched the jagged scar on his forearm, a long-ago gift from a cornered wolf. Her touch was gentle, questioning. He didn't pull away. In that small, silent gesture, 1,000 words were spoken. She was seeing him, not just as a protector, but as a person, scarred and fallible. He was seeing her, not as a burden, but as a partner. The bond between them, forged in silence and hardship, solidified into something unbreakable. He knew of a place, a ghost of a memory from his youth. A hidden valley, walled in by sheer granite cliffs, accessible only by a single, treacherous pass. A place to make a stand, or better yet, a home. The thought, unbidden, surprised him with its intensity. Home. It was a word he hadn't allowed himself to think for a very long time. The urgency to reach it became an obsession. The tracks of the men grew fresher. They were closing the distance. Silas could feel them, a pressure on his back, a prickling of the hairs on his neck. They were being hunted. He didn't know if the men sought retribution, or if they had simply circled back for the girl they'd discarded, perhaps realizing in their desperation that even a child was a resource to be bartered or consumed. The why didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the valley. They traveled through the night, guided by the cold light of the stars. The pass was a narrow, icy slit in the rock, a place where the wind shrieked and the footing was slick with verglars. He tied a rope around her waist, anchoring her to him. "Don't look down," he murmured, the first unnecessary words he had spoken to her in weeks. He felt her small hand grip the back of his coat, a knot of fierce trust. They emerged from the pass as the sun was rising, casting long, golden fingers of light across their destination. It was just as he remembered. A bowl of sheltered land, a creek running through its center like a silver ribbon, stands of old-growth pine promising shelter and fuel. It was a sanctuary. Safety. They were halfway down the slope when a voice echoed from the pass behind them. "Stop!" Silas froze, turning slowly. Two men stood silhouetted against the rising sun. They were gaunt, their faces hollowed out by hunger and desperation, their clothes little more than rags. He recognized them from the fleeting glimpse on the ridge. He pushed Ilara behind him, his hand going to his rifle. "We don't want no trouble," one of the men called out, his voice a hoarse croak. "We just want the girl." The man took a hesitant step forward, his hands held out in a gesture of placation. "Ilara," he said, using the name she had not heard since the day she was left behind. The sound of it made her flinch. "Your kin sent us. They made a mistake. They want you back." Silas remained motionless, a granite statue of defiance. He could end this. 2 shots. The men were weak, starving. It would be easy. But he looked at the man's eyes and saw not malice, but a desperate, pathetic hunger. They weren't monsters. They were just broken men, following the orders of other broken people. The second man, younger and more agitated, pointed a trembling finger. "She belongs with us. We have a claim." Silas's grip tightened on his rifle. The world narrowed to the space between them, the cold air thick with unspoken violence. It was in this moment, this terrible, fragile pause between what was and what would be, that Ilara moved. She stepped out from behind Silas's legs. She stood beside him, not behind him. Her small face was set, her eyes clear and steady. She looked at the men who had been her people, at their ragged clothes and their desperate faces, and she saw them for what they were, ghosts from a life that was no longer hers. She had been their burden. Now they wanted her back, not out of love, but out of need. The first man softened his voice, trying to coax her. "Ilara, come now. It's us." She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She opened her mouth, and a voice, small but clear as a bell, cut through the mountain silence. No, it was a single word, but it held the weight of 1,000 miles walked, of countless silent lessons, of a cloak shared in a storm. It was the sound of a choice being made. It was the sound of a shattered girl becoming whole. The men stared, stunned into silence. They had come for a lost, weeping child. They found this. This small, immovable object, standing beside a man who looked like he was carved from the mountain itself. They saw the bond between them, a thing more real and more powerful than their empty claims of kinship. The younger man swore under his breath, but the older one simply sagged, the last of his desperate hope draining away. He gave a slow, defeated nod, turned, and shuffled back towards the pass, his partner following behind. They were beaten, not by a bullet, but by a word. By a choice. Silas watched them go, then looked down at Ilara. Her hand found his, her small fingers lacing through his calloused ones. He squeezed it gently. They turned their backs on the pass and walked down into the golden light of their valley, together. The slow work began. They chose a spot near the creek, sheltered by a towering stand of pines. He taught her how to fell a tree, how to read the grain of the wood, how to use an adze to hew the logs flat. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and capable. She learned to build a fire with the flint and steel Maeve had given her, a small, proud ritual she performed each evening. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their movements falling into a comfortable, practiced rhythm. They built their home log by log, a testament to their shared will. As the walls rose, so did something else between them. A quiet joy. One afternoon, as she helped him notch a log, she looked up at him, a smear of dirt on her cheek. "My name is Ilara," she said, not as a memory, but as a statement. He stopped his work and looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the strength in her eyes, the resilience in her small frame. He saw a daughter. He touched her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away the dirt. "I know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name. That night, they sat before the hearth of their finished cabin, the fire casting dancing shadows on the new walls. The wind howled outside, but inside, it was warm and safe. It was home. The stoic hunter and the resilient child, a family forged not of blood, but of wilderness and will, sat in the quiet comfort of all they had built, their silent past giving way to a hopeful, spoken future.